The first time she walked into the grand auditorium, she had no name, no badge, and no seat assigned. She was 23, fresh out of grad school, still carrying the scent of subway rails and city sweat, dressed in a blazer one size too large and shoes with worn-down soles. She'd borrowed a pass from a friend who knew someone on the volunteer list. It wasn't official. It wasn't allowed. But it was necessary. The conference was elite, a symposium on algorithmic accountability, hosted by a panel of men who had never once had to spell their names twice to be heard. She found a spot along the side wall, near the back, notebook clutched like a shield. That day, she watched others present her ideas. Not copies, but echoes. Flawed, diluted versions of arguments she'd outlined in her thesis 6 months prior. She took notes anyway, highlighted what was missing, circled the ways their data collapsed around blind spots. Then, during the Q&A, she raised her hand. It stayed raised. No one called. No one looked. The next day, she sent emails. 3, then 6, then a dozen. She received 2 replies. One said they appreciated her enthusiasm. The other unsubscribed. She didn't stop. Over the next decade, she built alone. Her work grew not on stages, but in open-source forums, white papers, and GitHub threads. She dissected case studies late at night, proved predictive models failed minority groups by double-digit margins, demonstrated how biased inputs yielded dangerous decisions. No press covered her, but communities began to whisper. When a government office published flawed predictive policing data, it was her spreadsheet that corrected it. When a startup launched a facial recognition platform that failed on dark skin tones, it was her dataset that exposed the gap. One professor invited her to speak, then another. Soon, she was everywhere and nowhere. Her voice passed around as PDFs and shared links, a ghost in the academic machine, shaping minds without ever stepping into the spotlight. Then came the call. From them. The same conference that once turned away her hand now wanted her to be the keynote speaker. The irony made her laugh. But she accepted. Not to validate them, to face them, because some ghosts return not to haunt, but to correct the narrative. In the weeks before the event, she rehearsed late. Not in studios. In her apartment, pacing between the couch and the window, whispering sentences to the night sky. She timed every slide, edited every pause, sharpened every citation, because they would listen now, and she would not let them forget. She printed her badge the night before, S. Rivers, keynote speaker, and pinned it carefully inside her jacket. She wore her hair natural. No apologies. No compromises. She carried nothing but a flash drive and a plan. The morning of the speech, she walked through the doors just after sunrise. Early, like always, the staff hadn't recognized her. Not until the projector warmed up and the microphone turned on. Then the murmurs started. Then the silence fell. And just before she took the stage, she heard it. From the same man who had brushed past her years ago. From the same place where her hand once hung unanswered. Move, you're in the way. She didn't flinch, because she knew exactly where she was. In the center, the lights dimmed. A hush swept across the hall like a curtain being drawn. One by one, eyes turned to the stage. Phones slipped back into pockets. The sound of the room stilled into a breath. And she stood there, centered, alone, unblinking. She didn't wear the performance. No flashy suit. No borrowed confidence. Just a presence carved from years of rejection and resolve. Her slides weren't coded in corporate jargon. No graphs dancing with overcomplicated color schemes. Just clarity, truth, precision. The screen behind her lit up with the first slide. Black background, white letters. Who gets left behind when you optimize for everyone? No name, no logo, no welcome. The question hovered. She let the silence stretch. Let the weight of that sentence settle on their shoulders. And then she began, not with data, not with citations, but with a story about a grandmother flagged by a hospital's predictive system for low adherence risk even though she never missed a dose of medication in her life because the algorithm didn't account for handwritten logs or prepaid phones. About a child denied access to an educational program because the application portal couldn't verify his address in a shelter. About a man wrongfully arrested because facial recognition tagged him as someone he'd never even met. She didn't say their names. She said, "These are not glitches. These are patterns." Slide after slide, she unfolded a quiet storm. Bias embedded in code. Exclusion normalized through abstraction. She showed how data can't speak for the voiceless if it never included them in the first place. And they listened. Not just because she spoke well, because she spoke with what they couldn't unsee. She cited studies, traced funding trails, exposed decision trees that branched only toward the privileged. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another whispered something to a colleague. But no one left. Because her words weren't confrontational. They were undeniable. Then came the moment. The slide that read, "10 years ago, I sat in this room. Raised my hand. You never saw it." The silence broke, soft gasps, sideways glances. She didn't look at them for reaction. She looked ahead. Steady. Then came her conclusion. Not a demand. An invitation. To rebuild not just with inclusivity as decoration, but as the foundation. To stop pretending that neutrality is neutral when the system is already skewed. To see the unseen, not as an afterthought, but as the blueprint. When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. She unplugged the clicker, stepped back, and nodded once to the audience. And then they stood, one by one. Slow. Heavy. Earnest. It wasn't ovation. It was reckoning. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't deny her anymore. Not her voice. Not her work. Not her right to take up space. And as she exited stage left, she passed the man who had told her to move. This time, he stepped aside. The sound of the standing ovation faded behind her like a tide rolling out. She didn't stop to bask in it. She moved with the same pace she always had, measured, centered, without ceremony. Down the narrow hallway behind the stage, past crates of folded banners, bundles of tangled cables, and the rows of name badges lined up in alphabetical silence. No one followed her at first. Then, slowly, they did. The organizer, suddenly aware of his oversight. The junior staffer, eyes wide, carrying a clipboard as if it were a confession. And the first journalist, phone camera angled and breathless, trying to catch a moment that would already be gone before he hit record. She stopped only when she reached the side door leading out to the hotel loading dock. Gray light spilled in. Crisp air washed over her skin. It smelled like pavement and electricity, realer than the manicured gloss of the main entrance. She exhaled. 10 years. 10 years between that ignored question in the back row and the room that had just risen to its feet. But she didn't feel triumph. She felt clarity. Because she hadn't won anything. She had returned something. Truth to power. Vision to blindness. Presence to invisibility. And yet even now, the world scrambled to label her. By evening, hashtags appeared. Hashtag truthspeaker. Hashtag data queen. Hashtag bias breaker. Articles cropped up like weeds. Keynote disrupts status quo with radical transparency. Unexpected star redefines ethics in tech. She wasn't on our radar until now. They used words like unexpected, surprising, fresh perspective. As if she had burst onto the scene fully formed. They still didn't understand that she'd been here. Been watching. Been working. She received hundreds of messages. Some were genuine. Others were calculated. Opportunities, partnerships, speaking offers all pouring in now as if her value had just been unlocked by the right key. But she'd never needed a key. She had built the door. She declined most invitations. The ones that felt like window dressing. The ones that wanted her face but not her truth. She chose the ones that asked better questions. Ones that didn't ask her to explain her existence. Only her ideas. In the weeks that followed, she gave fewer speeches. She gave structure instead. Blueprints. Workshops. Funding tools for underrepresented coders. Data sets built from the margins, not the center. And quietly, without headlines, she began crafting a repository, a new infrastructure, a space not for speeches but for systems, not for her, for the ones still waiting in the back rows. The space didn't exist yet, not in walls, not in architecture, but it lived in her mind, blue and glowing, a sanctuary for thinking that didn't beg for permission, not a hub, not a lab, something softer, wiser. A space that didn't just tolerate difference, but centered it. She found a vacant building. Brick. Forgotten. Once a furniture showroom, then a discount pharmacy, then empty. Windows dusty, wiring exposed, paint curling away from age. Most saw decay. She saw potential. A blank schematic. She bought it quietly with funding sourced from the whispers, those who had listened when she spoke truth instead of convenience. No press release. No launch party. Just keys and silence. She walked the floor alone the first morning, every step echoing against plaster and memory. She traced her fingers along the walls like tracing the edges of an idea just beginning to take shape. She built the archive not as a museum, not as a brand, but as a living record. Workbenches, coding pods, community rooms, whiteboards that stretched across entire walls, filled not with rules but questions. One room had no chairs, only cushions and quiet, for thought that required stillness. Another was lined with printers and recycled tech, machines stripped of pedigree and pride, meant only for rebuilding. The door had no names, only a sign that read, "You belong here before you prove it." People came, not many at first. A grad student who'd dropped out, a refugee coder working nights at a diner, a young black girl who'd memorized the conference video and come to show her prototype. They didn't ask for help. They brought work. She gave them something the world rarely offered: context. She gave them datasets that told the right stories. She gave them history, stripped of polish, anchored in pain and innovation. She gave them blueprints for resistance coded in the language of systems. Not to disrupt, to rebuild. Word spread, quietly, then with urgency. People didn't come for her name. They came because they were tired of being in the way. And now they had a place that didn't move them aside. One evening, a woman approached her in the hallway, mid-40s, hesitant. She said, "I used to teach until I couldn't afford to anymore. I saw your video, thought maybe I still had something to offer." She handed over a notebook of curriculum. It was brilliant. She hired her on the spot. No resume, just presence. That became the archive's rule. You didn't need credentials to create, only clarity and care. She walked those halls every morning before sunrise. No badge now, no applause, just the rhythm of her shoes on tile and the quiet of something finally growing without permission. She didn't stand on stages anymore. She built them, then stepped aside, so others could rise. Winter settled around the archive in soft drifts of gray. Inside, the hum of machines layered against quiet footsteps and fingers tapping keys. Screens glowed in corners, scattered like lanterns in a library of tomorrow. She sat at a wide desk, not as a leader, never in title, but as an architect of space. A young developer slid a prototype into her hands, a browser extension that detected exclusionary language in real-time corporate policies. Another showed her a wearable device that vibrated gently when online forms flagged non-binary identities as invalid. She said little. She rarely said much anymore, because what she needed to speak had already been spoken, and now it lived in them. They were her response, her echo. One day, an email arrived from the same conference organizers who had once handed her a badge barely worth its laminate. They asked her to return, not as speaker, as host, a curator of vision, a keynote maker. The irony no longer stung. It didn't land at all. She read it once, then archived it. She didn't need the podium anymore. She was the platform. Elsewhere across the country, a university unveiled a new department in her name. Students posted selfies beside the sign, not for the prestige, but because it made them possible. In a downtown gallery, a projection played her original keynote speech on loop, captioned in 10 languages, layered over black and white footage of quiet resistance, women marching, workers coding, children drawing futures no one else could see. Still, she didn't attend the unveilings. She taught, quietly, daily. A new intern once asked her, "Do you miss the spotlight?" She smiled but didn't answer, because the question missed the point. She'd never chased light. She'd always worked in shadow, shaping it. And now others shone because of it. She moved through the archive like breath, present but invisible, never in the way, because she was the way. And one night, after hours, when the last coder had gone home and the screens had dimmed, she sat alone in the same chair she'd used since opening day. She opened a journal, wrote a single sentence. "The rooms they tried to keep me out of, I rebuilt without walls." She closed it. No signature, no audience, just silence. and the sound of something finally becoming permanent. The archive was humming long before sunrise. Students filtered in with half-zip jackets and steaming cups, shoulders wrapped in scarves and ideas. No one waited for instructions. They knew the rhythm now. The space had trained them to listen to each other, to the world, to themselves. She watched from the second floor, palms pressed to the cool railing, observing the quiet choreography of progress unfolding below. She could feel when the world was changing, even if no one announced it. A girl in the far corner adjusted her code to remove biased medical inputs from a national dataset. A boy next to her rewrote a curriculum so that 10-year-olds could learn the history of exclusion and the math to dismantle it. Someone was painting a mural. Another rebuilding a laptop from scraps. They moved like a future being written with no punctuation, just momentum. And she knew this was the keynote. Not the one they broadcast, but the one that echoed on. She no longer had to lead to be followed. One morning, a small envelope was slid under the archive's door. No stamp, no return address. Just a folded piece of paper inside. Handwritten. You won't remember me. I was the girl sitting 2 rows in front of you at that first symposium. I saw you raise your hand. I remember thinking, why don't they call on her? I didn't speak up. I wish I had. But last week, my daughter stood in front of her class and presented a model of the archive for her school project. She said it's a place that makes room for people before the world does. Thank you for being the kind of speaker who didn't just talk. You built something that stayed. She folded the letter once more, pressed it into a drawer beside dozens like it, and quietly went back to work. The world no longer asked her to prove she belonged. It now asked her, how do we build what you built? She answered the only way she ever had, without a stage, without a spotlight, and never above anyone. She answered by making space. That year, the archive expanded into 5 cities. Then 7. None carried her name. Only the mission. Each one had the same etched phrase above the entrance. You belong here before you prove it. And one day, years later, when a new conference rose, built on different rules and newer truths, a young woman stood behind the podium as keynote. Her name wasn't famous. Her face wasn't known. But her voice was steady. And the first thing she said to the crowd was, there are people in this room who once told others to move. And there are people who were told they were in the way. But I'm here because someone chose to stay anyway. Her silence moved louder than their commands. And now we speak forward because she made it possible. The applause wasn't for nostalgia. It was for a future that had finally arrived. Because of her. Because she had never left.